In 1903, the state of Pennsylvania created a commission to determine how many of those residing in the state suffered from mental illness. Unfortunately, back then, there was much to learn about persistent mental afflictions, and many of those who suffered had found their way into hospitals and prisons. To alleviate pressure on the prison and hospital systems, a new dedicated hospital was established, where people who suffered from mental illness or physical disabilities could be properly cared for. This was a great idea on paper, but as it turns out, not so much in practice. The project would result in the construction of a facility that represented an incredibly dark and deeply shameful chapter in the history of Pennsylvania, as well as the country at large. Coincidentally, the building would come to be regarded as one of the most haunted places in the world. At the time of its construction, the Pennhurst State School and Hospital was located in a desolate area. The intent was to keep separation between patients and the rest of society, as they claimed, for safety. Patients at Pennhurst were given jobs at the facility and were subject to unpaid and, in some cases, reportedly harsh labor conditions. They made mattresses and shoes. They farmed, they baked, and helped with facility upkeep. Pennhurst was its own self-contained community. It even had its own railway station, where coal and other supplies were delivered. The tracks are still there today. The first patient was admitted to Pennhurst on November 23, 1908. The hospital was designed to accommodate 500 patients. However, just 4 years later, there were more than 2,800 patients living full-time at the facility. In addition, its focus on both mental and physical rehabilitation had become muddied. Pennhurst was now home to immigrants, orphans, and even dangerous criminals. As more and more patients were being admitted, absent allocations of extra funding or extra staff, the situation quickly began to deteriorate. Pennhurst's chief physician once inferred that every person with mental illness is a potential criminal. He was referencing the work of Henry H. Goddard, who was a leading eugenicist at the time. But this was implicit of the dark and antiquated mindset of the facility's leadership. Patients that misbehaved or rebelled against the substandard conditions were placed in solitary confinement, an often brutal punishment for people afflicted with mental illness. Some patients would purposefully injure themselves so that the staff would be forced to let them out of isolation. Tied patients would often try to bite abusive staff members, presumably in self-defense. Those patients would have their teeth removed. Dr. Jesse G. Fear was an on-staff doctor, infamously known for brutally abusing patients. He would torture the helpless with painful and unnecessary intravenous injections. He would direct staff to house passive patients with violent criminals, studying their sometimes fatal interaction. Under his supervision, Dr. Fear would build an abhorrently abusive culture within the hospital walls, establishing patients as nothing more than lab rats. Dangerous physical and mental testing would be carried out on patients, some resulting in, quote, accidental death. Decades later, stories of the atrocities that precipitated at Pennhurst would finally leak. In 1968, a reporter named Bill Baldini received a tip from a remorseful staff member and would produce a groundbreaking 5-part television news report exposing the truly horrific conditions at Pennhurst. The public was outraged. Front-page newspaper articles referred to Pennhurst as the shame of Pennsylvania. Baldini's reports were a major blow to the reputation of Pennhurst and would signal the beginning of the end for the storied hospital. But the final nail in the coffin was hammered in by one of the patients years later, a woman named Terry Lee Halderman, who was allowed to leave the facility for a weekend to visit her parents. Halderman returned home that weekend battered, bruised, and said to be missing teeth, prompting her parents to file a very public lawsuit against the facility. The Halderman's victory would lead the court to mandate the total shutdown of Pennhurst in 1987. The remaining 1,156 patients who were still there were moved into different community homes, many with far more favorable conditions than that of Pennhurst. The case of Halderman versus Pennhurst became known as the Pennhurst Doctrine and is now binding precedent under U.S. constitutional law. To this day, it is unknown just how many patients died at Pennhurst, but paranormal enthusiasts who have visited the site in the years since its closure have said that the pronounced energy of those trapped patients still persists. Pennhurst State School and Hospital is said to be among the most haunted places in the world. According to historians and paranormal researchers, perhaps the most famous ghost of Pennhurst is an entity nicknamed the King. He is believed to be a maintenance man who worked at Pennhurst during the 1940s and the 50s, presumably witnessing the height of patient abuse at the facility. The entity's domain is said to be the boiler room in the basement of the Mayflower building. He is said to appear as a shadowy figure, but some have said that he can even touch and choke people who dare to set foot in the boiler room. It is said that one can smell cigar smoke when he appears. Paranormal enthusiasts often bring cigars and cigarettes down to the boiler room in order to try to incite an appearance of the apparition. Others avoid the boiler room altogether, preferring not to tempt fate. The King is one of many ghosts said to be haunting Pennhurst, and the Mayflower building in particular is thought to be a central hotspot of paranormal activity. Visitors to the building in its abandoned state say that they were overwhelmed by feelings of dread and sadness as soon as they stepped inside. Visitors report instances of slamming doors, hearing footsteps, and the sound of someone vomiting. Some have reported eerie 1940s era music. Some people have heard disembodied voices telling people to go away, threatening them, or asking for help. The Quaker building is said to be another paranormal hotspot. Some have reported seeing dark figures and a plainly visible ghost of a girl with long black hair and strange dangling arms. Visitors have been pushed and scratched by unseen forces and have even had things thrown at them. Since its closure in 1987, the facility's dark past has been reframed by an appreciation for its architectural beauty and haunted history. While much of the facility has fallen into disrepair, parts of the campus have been restored or maintained and play host to paranormal enthusiasts and those that are curious to attend a nighttime ghost hunting tour. There have been plans made to repurpose the land and other parts of the campus over the years, but nothing has moved forward. For now, it seems as though the old Pennhurst State School and Hospital may be destined to live out the rest of its days as a haunted attraction, visited only by curious investigators and inhabited only by the spirits of the patients who died there. The judge who presided over the infamous and bloody Salem witch trials, John Hathorne, lived on Hathorne Hill in Danvers, Massachusetts. And it's most certainly a fitting coincidence that this same location would be home to the Danvers State Hospital, a notorious institution with a very dark history. The hospital, which opened in 1878, would come to be known for the brutal mistreatment of patients and associated deaths. As a result, the Danvers State Hospital was reputed to be one of the most haunted locations on Earth. Danvers State Hospital and its extensive infrastructure was designed to be a self-sustaining community. This meant that everything it needed to operate could be found on site. It was a beautiful, elaborate building and had been widely celebrated by architectural enthusiasts. It had red brick construction and towering Gothic spirals. On the outside, the facility was stately and noble-looking, a misleading cover for the alleged horrors that took place within its walls. Danvers State Hospital was originally known as the State Lunatic Asylum at Danvers. At the time, the term lunatic was a socially appropriate, catch-all word used to classify those afflicted with mental illness. In the late 1800s, the common medical theory was that people with psychological problems could be completely cured with the help of specially designed facilities like Danvers. The State Lunatic Asylum at Danvers enjoyed a favorable reputation, at least initially. The facility employed 125 people, and in the first 3 decades of operation, boasted the treatment of as many as 10,000 total patients. With such a positive reputation, Danvers became a magnet facility, attracting patients from around the country. But like so many similar institutions in the United States, the designed maximum occupancy seemed to be a forgotten metric. By the 1930s, the hospital housed as many as 2,000 residents. While the administrators of Danvers lobbied the state of Massachusetts for more money and more critical resources, those requests were unanswered. Living conditions were far below basic hygienic standards. Patients frequently walked through the hallways completely naked, as clothing resources were in short supply. Patients were malnourished. They were given needed medication inconsistently and were unbathed. And of course, psychological treatment fell by the wayside. With order at the facility unraveling quickly, staff at Danvers resorted to faster, more unconventional methods of treatment. These new treatment tactics were exceptionally unethical and brutally abusive. Shock therapy, where powerful electric shocks were administered to bound patients, became the norm. The idea that strong jolts of electricity could alter a patient's brain for the better was accepted among medical staff at the facility. Alternatively, it would be used as a scare tactic to control patient behavior. Those who misbehaved were often put into straitjackets and locked away. Eventually, shock therapy would become a second choice to lobotomies at Danvers. In the late 1930s, the medical community was looking for a solution to the overcrowding crisis facing mental health facilities across the country. Many looked to lobotomies as a potential and permanent solution that would render patients with severe mental illness, especially those with a propensity for violence, passive enough to leave the facility. By 1939, the patient population of Danvers had ballooned to 2,360, and the hospital, still lacking adequate resources and staffing, would see as many as 278 of those patients die at the facility that year alone. Out of desperation, the medical staff at Danvers willfully embraced lobotomies as a near-term fix for the increasingly dire situation. The medical science of the day pointed to lobotomies as an all-purpose cure for any kind of mental illness. Danvers is often regarded as the birthplace of the prefrontal lobotomy. But contrary to their original intent, many lobotomy patients at Danvers were reported to just aimlessly wander through the halls. Many of them would stare blankly at walls and act as though they were in a drug-induced daze. And instead of being cured and allowed to move on to other assisted facilities, often they were not allowed to leave and remained as part of the growing population of residents living and dying within the walls of the hospital. The lack of funding and resources continued to plague the facility, and by the 1960s, buildings fell into total disrepair. Eventually, the state intervened and parts of Danvers State Hospital were shut down by 1969. Other parts of the facility were actually used through 1992. When the hospital ceased operations, the imposing abandoned building drew curiosity among ghost hunters and photographers, seeking to document the notoriously haunted location in a state of decay. But because the building was closed to the public, documented ghost hunts at the former hospital are scarce. Many people have been arrested trying to sneak into the haunted property, seeking a chance encounter with one of the many tortured souls that may have lingered behind. In 2005, a development company decided to buy the now rundown property and demolished a large portion of the buildings. The property underwent a major renovation that turned the once grim asylum into a modern luxury apartment complex. However, the project faced a major delay in 2007 when a mysterious fire broke out, causing substantial damage. Some attributed the fire to a curse invoked by the tormented spirits of dead patients. The quote, Hell House on the Hill, which is one of Danvers' many locally adorned nicknames, looks immaculate today. Since its closure, the former hospital has enjoyed a spotlight in popular culture as well. The horror writer H.P. Lovecraft used Danvers as the main inspiration for the fictional Albans Sanatorium. Today, alongside a brighter, modern use for the facility, lies a sobering reminder of the hospital's grim history. 2 nearby cemeteries contain 770 bodies belonging to former Danvers patients. Many of their headstones have numbers instead of names. Many families with relatives at Danvers were ashamed of the association. As such, administrators at Danvers commissioned hundreds of anonymous headstones. Many of these graves remain unidentified to this day. It's no surprise that Danvers is regarded as one of the most haunted locations in the world. While most of the facility has been demolished and completely rebuilt, history will ensure that the dark and fascinating legacy of the Danvers State Hospital will live on. If you're familiar with the term Bedlam, you may not be familiar with the term's origin. The term is a nickname for a storied asylum in London called Bethlem Royal Hospital. In its more than 775 years of existence, the institution has served as part hospital, part prison, and part human zoo. The hospital was known to play host to some of the most unimaginable patient living conditions in the civilized world. Bethlem Royal Hospital in the 15th century, as it was said to operate, resembled a scene right out of a horror movie. It was an institution established for handling the rejects of society, those who were deemed too mentally ill to fit in, or those who had chosen not to fit in by becoming criminals. And as one could imagine, the mix of dangerous criminals alongside psychiatric patients in a facility that lacked proper separation altogether was a recipe for disaster, not to mention complete disorder. Bethlem was notorious for overcrowding and was heavily under-resourced. As we've seen with similar institutions through history, the staff's inability to control patients led to a complete abandonment of ethics driven by a total absence of accountability. As such, often helpless patients were subjected to abhorrent cruelty, humiliation, and dangerous medical experimentation through the beginning of the 20th century. Somewhere along the line, the infamous institution was adorned with the nickname Bedlam from Bethlem, which is now synonymous with chaos or confusion. The building itself was considered an architectural marvel at the time, even through its numerous iterations. It was rebuilt in the 17th century based on a design inspired by the Tuileries Palace in Paris. It was a beautiful hospital set within sprawling grounds, tree-lined gardens, and paved walkways. But its royal-looking exterior hid a grotesque operation within its walls. Patients would be admitted to Bethlem suffering from conditions described as chronic mania or acute melancholy. These now obsolete terms were used to broadly classify mental illness before the field of psychology offered more formalized definitions. And alongside those afflicted with mental illness, the hospital also admitted criminals, ranging from petty thieves to dangerous serial killers. The word treatment was a relatively loose term at Bethlem Royal Hospital, usually pertaining to basic isolation and experimentation. Patients usually ended up significantly worse after their stay, that is, if they survived. One treatment methodology frequently employed by staff at Bethlem was known as rotating therapy. A patient would be strapped to a chair, which was then suspended from the ceiling. The device then rotated, sometimes up to 100 rotations per minute. The purpose was to induce vomiting quickly, which was thought to be an all-purpose cure for a variety of ailments at the time. Medieval doctors thought that mental problems were largely the same as physical problems, where purging the body of toxins, in some cases, would make sense. Incidentally, records kept on rotating therapy cases at the hospital would end up contributing to later research on vertigo, so somewhat of a rare silver lining in this particular case. And along the same lines as induced vomiting, bloodletting was another common treatment at the hospital. Doctors believed that mental conditions could be addressed by letting the patient bleed out. Unfortunately, many patients did not survive this procedure. Throughout the 17th century, mismanagement and a lack of funding and resources would drive the hospital into a severe state of disrepair and chaos. It was the only mental health facility in Britain at the time, and was largely reliant on government funding and private donation in order to operate. Private donors, however, were few and far between, driven by the hospital's rapidly spiraling reputation. It was no secret that Bethlem Royal Hospital was a grossly mismanaged, shameful institution. It had such a poor reputation that it was referenced in famous plays of the time by Shakespeare and Thomas Middleton, as well as books by Charles Dickens. Desperate by the 18th century, hospital administration would revert to a highly unethical practice to fund the hospital's operations. Bethlem would invite public viewing of its patients, as if they were an exhibit. The curious would travel from afar to view the patients purely for entertainment. Some people would even go there on public holidays. At its height, it is estimated that the hospital saw nearly 100,000 visitors per year. As the patient population continued to increase, Bethlem Royal Hospital began to fall into even greater disrepair. The 1601 Relief of the Poor Act made things even worse. The act stated that the poor who were unable to work would be sent to prisons or workhouses. These places were thought to be even worse than Bethlem. As a result, beggars and petty criminals would sometimes pretend to be mentally ill in order to avoid getting sent to these prisons, and instead they would be sent to Bethlem. As one could imagine, this worsened the overcrowding of the hospital, creating living conditions that rivaled the notorious prisons. When patients died in the hospital, some corpses were selected for study by doctors and scientists, but most were thrown into mass graves, the largest of which was located on Liverpool Street in London. As recently as 2013, railway construction workers in London stumbled upon a mass grave containing as many as 20,000 bodies, the oldest of which dated all the way back to the 16th century. Many of these bodies are thought to have belonged to patients from Bethlem Royal Hospital. In 1815, the British House of Commons Select Committee on Madhouses decided to formally investigate the conditions of British asylums. They examined county asylums, private institutions, and charitable hospitals, looking at how patients lived and how they were treated. The principal physician at Bethlem Royal Hospital, Thomas Monroe, was forced to resign as a result. The commission determined that he was, quote, wanting in humanity, which is an arguably polite way of saying that he was basically evil. 2 decades later, Dr. William Hood, who worked at Bethlem, initiated several formal rehabilitation programs with a focus on patient well-being and improvement. He also pushed for separation of those patients who suffered from mental illness from those who were deemed criminals. He would later be knighted for his accomplishments. During World War II, Bethlem Royal Hospital was moved out of the city to a rural location in efforts to provide a better quality of life for the patients. Moving locations was another major step toward improving the horrible legacy of Bedlam. Bethlem Royal Hospital still operates to this day, and while rehabilitation programs are far more effective in these modern times, the hospital looks to its grim history as a sign of just how far we've come as a society in understanding mental illness. While the terrifying original hospital building was abandoned in favor of a new location, Those who are interested in the history of storied asylums and institutions, not to mention the paranormal, still look to Bethlem Royal as a beacon of darkness. At its conception in the 1850s, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was meant to be a first-of-its-kind institution, a hopeful solution to treating the mentally insane. Built on the ideals of Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride, one of the pioneering leaders of fair and humane mental health treatment, the West Virginia Hospital was meant to be a place where those struggling with mental illness could receive compassionate care while keeping freedom and control over their lives. While these initial intentions were pure, the asylum, unfortunately, turned out to become what could only be described as a true hospital of horrors. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum opened for patients in 1863. The facility could treat as many as 250 patients at a time, and was adorned with breathtaking hand-cut stone masonry, tall windows, and self-sustaining features including an on-site farm, water and gas wells, and a cemetery. For years, the asylum provided comfortable shelter to patients, but by 1881 it was quickly overwhelmed as the world faced the stigma surrounding mental illness. Many patients were admitted for peculiar reasons, including laziness, grief, seduction, and even novel reading. The world simply did not have the understanding of mental illness as it does today, and many suffered at the hands of ignorance. The Trans-Allegheny Asylum was running out of space to treat the influx of patients arriving at the facility. In the late 1800s, capacity had been exceeded by over 500. As a result, conditions began to rapidly decline. Numerous patients were assigned to rooms that were made for one, and the property's farm animals were unable to keep up with the demands of the stream of patients, resulting in malnourishment for many. These factors only worsened the state of those in the asylum, leaving the chaos that was about to ensue almost inevitable. With the world's ignorance to mental illness came experimental treatments that gravely contradicted the principles of the facility's founder, Dr. Kirkbride. The asylum took up many medical practices throughout the years, including ice water baths, electroshock therapy, isolation cells, and even lobotomies. One of the most common procedures conducted at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was the ice pick lobotomy, which occurs when a doctor attempts to, quote, fix the prefrontal cortex of a patient's brain by piercing the inner corner of the eye with an ice pick using force to reach the brain. In 1952 alone, one doctor at the asylum was recorded to have performed 228 lobotomies during a 2-week period. At the time, it was believed that this procedure could alter a patient's behavior enough to hopefully cure their illness. This procedure was gruesome, and in most cases, caused severe permanent damage to the patient. The facility continued to attempt to meet the needs of the patients seeking care, but their capacity to do so only dwindled as time went on. By the 1930s, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was housing 6 times the number of patients it had been designed to serve. Overwhelmed staff attempted to control the facility, but the sheer number of patients severely outnumbered them. At its peak, the asylum was housing as many as 2,400 patients, 10 times over capacity. Word spread of the inhumane conditions patients were enduring at the asylum, and the local Charleston Gazette conducted an investigation. What they found was chilling. Patient beds lined the freezing floors, in hallways and throughout the rooms. The windows were caked with grime, and the wallpaper was peeling. Patients were increasingly becoming more violent as overcrowding worsened. There were several cases of patients murdering one another, including one instance of 2 patients hanging another using a set of bed sheets. When their attempt was unsuccessful, the pair beat his head with a metal bed frame. Patients also continued their attacks on overworked staff. Several female employees were sexually assaulted, and one nurse went missing on duty, only to be found months later decomposing in a disused stairwell. Over the years, the Charleston Gazette continued to publish shocking allegations against the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. In 1985, they reported that many patients were roaming naked and left in unsanitary rooms. Some of those deemed inconsolable were kept locked in cages. In 1992, the paper exposed the asylum yet again for unlivable conditions. These allegations and the number of patients that continued to die at the hands of violence and negligence resulted in the ultimate closure of the facility by 1994. The cemetery on the property is the final resting place of over 2,000 patients that once lived at the hospital. Many of these tortured souls are said to roam the halls of the storied facility. While many of these sightings have occurred since the asylum permanently closed, the hauntings were reported during its years of operations. One doctor who previously worked at the facility has reported that a spirit followed her home and continues to present itself to her, even today. Since its closure, the hospital has become an attraction for paranormal thrill seekers. Many have reported seeing various orbs floating down hallways and apparitions dressed in all white. The building's first floor is allegedly home to a spirit named Ruth. Ruth was a former patient of the Trans-Allegheny Asylum who had a passionate distaste for men. While she was alive, Ruth reportedly had a habit of throwing various objects at the men assigned to treat her. In her afterlife, Ruth has been accused of targeting men and is known to physically push them against walls. On the second floor, investigators have reportedly witnessed the aftermath of several violent offenses that took place in Ward 2. It was here that one patient endured 17 stab wounds inflicted by another patient. 2 more hung themselves from curtain rods. Investigators have reported sightings of shadowy apparitions, accompanied by disembodied voices. The third floor is haunted by more patient violence, including suicides and murders. 2 spirits in particular are said to be present here: a former patient named Big Jim, and a nurse known as Elizabeth. Investigators have reported sightings of apparitions and figures, and have witnessed doors slamming on their own. Terrifying noises have been captured on paranormal investigation devices. One of the most famous spirits is reported to haunt the 4th floor. A young girl named Lily supposedly waits for visitors to arrive and play with her many toys. Some have heard sounds of a music box playing and have seen toys move around the room on their own. Lily is reported to have lived nearly her entire short life in the asylum. She died of pneumonia at age 9. In addition to these specific sightings, many who have dared to take one of the asylum's ghost tours have heard screams, maniacal laughter, and wails throughout the halls. While patients are not currently receiving care at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, it seems that many of those who once did are forever trapped in an excruciating loop of torment, unable to escape. Among the rolling hills of southwestern Virginia lies an imposing stately brick building regarded as one of the most haunted locations in America. Known as the St. Albans Sanatorium, the building itself is massive, over 68,000 square feet in size, and sits perched on a hilltop near Radford, Virginia. St. Albans is now privately owned and leverages its dark past to full advantage. It currently operates as a historical site, but the owners are fully aware of the history of the land and the building, and use this to host periodic ghost tours, a zombie apocalypse event, Friday the 13th celebrations, and even a haunted house at Halloween. Fear sells, and St. Albans does not disappoint. So what's the paranormal significance here? Well, take a tour and you'll understand. Walking through the entrance, there's a heavy feeling that never leaves. The walls are grimy with paint peeling everywhere. There are broken toys scattered around on the floor as if their owners just gave up on them. Rusting old wheelchairs lurk in dark corners. In certain areas, you can only imagine what kind of horrors took place inside these walls through the years. Visitors can still see the metal mesh covering the rooftop garden that was installed to keep patients from leaping off to their death. Visiting the electroshock therapy room will chill you, spurring vivid thought about the terrible things that went on in there. One room has a lone rocking chair that tends to rock on its own. The suicide bathroom will make you feel sick in the pit of your stomach. There were at least 4 suicides that happened in that very room. If you're truly brave, go down to the basement to see the bowling alley. There are supposedly the spirits of a young girl and another of a woman that appears as a mist when her name is mentioned. If the physical appearances don't creep you out, wait until you have an actual encounter with one of the many spirits that haunt the place. Visitors and volunteers alike have had numerous encounters with the spirits haunting St. Albans. They've reported seeing full-body apparitions, shadow figures, levitating objects, noticeable temperature drops, and the aforementioned rocking chair rocking on its own. Visitors have also heard disembodied voices. They felt cold breezes blow from out of nowhere and felt an actual touch by someone that wasn't there. They can feel panicked, dizzy, or nauseous, but that's mild compared to what happened to a volunteer security officer. He was actually picked up and thrown into a doorway by some unseen force. The feelings of dread and panic hit at every turn. But why? Who could these spirits be? To answer those questions, we'll have to take a look back through time. In all honesty, the spirits could be from over 300 years of history at the location. Native Americans have been in the area for centuries, but the first recorded official Native American settlement and village was around 1600 AD. The area was prized for the ancient river flowing through it, as well as the fertile farmland. In fact, the New River is the second oldest river in the world, coming in only behind the Nile. White settlers did not invade the area until the mid-1700s, when Dr. Thomas Walker created a small settlement on the banks of the New River. In the winter of 1755, in nearby Draper's Meadow, now Blacksburg, Mary Draper Ingalls was captured by Native Americans and transported to Ohio. Mary escaped and walked around 800 miles back home following creeks and streams. She ate nuts and roots to stave off starvation. Her journey is one of the best examples of female heroism ever recorded in frontier history. But that wasn't all that happened. Holding true to the ways of the white settlers at the time, the new residents of the village, then known as Lovely Mountain, displaced the Native Americans and began farming and settling the area. The village stayed fairly small until the railroad came to the New River. The railroad brought forth the need for a station, workers, iron foundries, lumber mills, and all services related to sustaining the new population and industrial growth. The Civil War brought battles, destruction, and death to the entire area. Bridges were burned, houses and farms were destroyed as the Confederacy battled the Union. The railroad was attacked by both sides for different reasons. One day, after winning a very bloody battle at Cloyd's Mountain, Union General George Cooke took his army of the Kanawha and destroyed the New River Bridge in Radford. Blood soaked into the soil and set the stage for the worst of the area's history yet to come. In 1892, the St. Albans Lutheran Boys' School was built with the intent of carving out college-ready young men. The building was designed to accommodate up to 50 boys. While the intentions of the school were good at first, the school became increasingly competitive and demanding. It encouraged bullying to weed out weaker students. In fact, the learning environment was so hostile that there were multiple suicides from bullying and pressure to succeed at any cost. The school closed its doors in 1911. The building sat vacant until 1916, when Dr. J.C. King reopened the doors as a home for the mentally disabled. While the horrific conditions of similar institutions were well known, Dr. King wanted St. Albans to be different and a better alternative to other asylums across the United States. He envisioned an advanced treatment facility that focused on patient activity and participation to supplement their therapies. There was a rooftop garden and a small farm that supplied fresh, homegrown produce. There was even a bowling alley installed in the basement for patient and staff recreation. Additions were built onto the existing structure to expand the capacity. However, Dr. King's vision quite missed its mark when patients began to arrive. Instead of being a paradise, St. Albans was a nightmare from the beginning. Patients were subjected to experimental procedures and treatments that resulted in numerous deaths or permanent disabilities. The patients who survived the treatments experienced significant declines in their conditions. They were forced to endure radical and painful treatments like insulin-induced comas, hydrotherapy, electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and hydroshock therapy. But what happened to the countless number of patients who lost their lives in the horrendous conditions at the sanatorium? Staff and visitors say they're still roaming the property. Throughout the period of operation, staff and patients must have had children around, hence finding toys scattered around the building and the supposed apparition of the young girl in the bowling alley. The other spirit in the basement that appears as a mist. Who was it? She appears when visitors say her name, Gina Hall. According to the Virginia cold case files, Gina Hall was an 18-year-old local Radford University student who disappeared on June 28, 1980, after attending a party in Blacksburg. She phoned her sister at 1:30 a.m., saying she was at Clater Lake with her friend Stephen Epperly, but would be home by 6 a.m. to meet a friend. When she did not arrive home, her sister notified the authorities. To summarize the case, Stephen Epperly was a 28-year-old teacher who was also local to Radford. Hall's car was found 2 days later under a railroad trestle about a half-mile from St. Albans. DNA in the car was shown to belong to Hall, and Epperly became the focus of the investigation. He claimed his innocence throughout, but was ultimately arrested and charged with her murder. In June 1993, Epperly was convicted of the first-degree murder of Gina Hall, and was the first man convicted of murder in the state of Virginia, where the victim's body was never found. While Epperly was imprisoned, Hall's sister kept trying to determine the whereabouts of her sister's remains. In 2019, Diana Bodmer, Gina Hall's sister, ran into a forensic anthropologist who had invented a device that could detect DNA that was buried in soil. With the help of Dr. Vass, the anthropologist, Bodmer uncovered remains of her sister scattered at 8 different sites throughout the New River Valley. As uncomfortable as that was, other remains were also found in those sites from unknown victims. Epperly was denied parole in 2019 and is still incarcerated at the Lawrenceville Correctional Center in Brunswick County, Virginia. But why would Gina Hall's spirit be in the bowling alley at St. Albans? Well, her car was found close to the site, but there is speculation that Epperly once worked at St. Albans and used his knowledge to get into the building and dismember her body in the basement. With all of the trauma, terror, blood, pain, and horrors that occurred on the site of St. Albans, it's no wonder there are restless spirits still roaming the halls of the asylum that imprisoned them. Some may want their stories to be told, and some may be out to exact revenge on anyone who comes near. But one thing is for sure, while St. Albans Sanatorium was no Garden of Eden for the poor souls who were sent there, it surely is a ghost hunter's paradise. My name is Scott, and thank you so much for watching. We are Mystery Syndicate. If you like what we do, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. Leave a comment and give this video a like. And to be notified when we post new videos, hit that notification bell. Also, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and Patreon. And for exclusive merchandise, visit our website at www.mysterysyndicate.com. From all of us at Mystery Syndicate, thank you again. We sincerely appreciate your support.